Look, I know it sounds contradictory, but I consider myself both an anarcho-communist and a Zionist. Yes, Zionist. I can see you raising an eyebrow already. How can I, as an anarchist who opposes states and hierarchies, embrace a movement that founded the Israeli state? Well, Zionism is more complex than just cheering for the Israeli government. Originally, it was about Jewish self-determination and even utopian communal experiments. The early Zionist settlers included anarchists and communists trying to live out Kropotkin-esque ideals of mutual aid on kibbutzim. They built collective farms with no bosses, equal sharing of resources, and direct self-management. Believe it or not, their goal was to create what they called a free socialist society of Jews and Arabs in Palestine. They even read anarchist thinkers like Proudhon and Kropotkin in their movement's publications. One famous early Zionist, Joseph Trumpeldor, straight up declared himself an anarcho-communist and a Zionist. That's literally how he identified. So there is a historical thread of anarcho-communist Zionism. It's not just me making this up in 2025.
Okay, I am raising an eyebrow, probably both. I have to admit, this is the first time I'm hearing someone personally claim anarcho-communist Zionist with a straight face. I get that there were some left-wing Zionists back in the day. Sure, early kibbutzim were communal and egalitarian internally. I've read about those ideals of living without bosses and building a new society. And yeah, Trumpeldor's quote is famous in some circles. The guy literally lost an arm fighting in the Russian military, then devoted himself to communal farming in Palestine, all while calling himself an anarcho-communist. Fine. I won't deny there were elements of anarchist or socialist thought in parts of the Zionist movement, but you're painting a rosy picture. My skepticism is because Zionism in practice didn't stay this libertarian dream, it became a nationalist, settler colonial project. Those lofty ideals of a free socialist society, who was that society for? From what I know, it was mainly for Jewish settlers. However much they spoke of cooperation with local Arabs, in reality, many communes and militias explicitly excluded indigenous Palestinians. One historical analysis put it bluntly, the Zionist commune was often imagined as one without Palestinians, so while these kibbutz folks preached equality and freedom, it sadly applied only within their group. The land they settled didn't fall from the sky, it was acquired in a colonial context, often displacing the Arab peasants who had lived and farmed there for generations. That critique argues that any progressive ideals the kibbutzim had were nullified by the massive inequality and dispossession underlying their creation. I mean, how anarchist is it to build an egalitarian commune on land where others were kicked out or marginalized? That sounds like a contradiction, if not outright hypocrisy.
These are harsh words, comrade. Settler colonial, displacement, hypocrisy, I hear you. Let me respond to the historical point before we dive into the big theory. It's true. Zionist settlement happened in the context of British colonial rule and a local population that, unsurprisingly, didn't want to be pushed aside. There's no denying that Palestinians were hurt in the process. Later on, a lot hurt, as we'll discuss. But early on, some Zionists genuinely opposed the idea of excluding Arabs or creating a Jewish nation state. You know, there were Zionist factions that explicitly rejected establishing a Jewish state, right? For example, the group Brit Shalom in the 1920s, and later Ehud, led by people like Martin Buber and Judah Magnuses, advocated a binational society, Jews and Arabs living together in one community without a Jewish supremacy in government. Even Hashomer Hatzair, a socialist Zionist youth movement, remained binationalist in its program up until 1947. They and many kibbutz members aspired to a Zionism inclusive of all ethnicities and religions, not an ethno-state. So there was an internal battle within Zionism about its direction. It wasn't inevitable that a Jewish nation state with all its exclusionary trappings had to form. There was a version of Zionism that was more about cultural revival and living securely, without necessarily erecting borders or kicking others out.
I hear what you're saying. There were indeed more idealistic strains of Zionism. It's a good historical point that even some self-identified Zionists opposed creating a Jewish state, and instead wanted a federated or binational arrangement with Palestinian Arabs. But the thing is, those strains lost. By 1948, the Zionist movement did establish a state, and not a binational pluralistic one, but a predominantly Jewish state that, in effect, ethnically cleansed most of the Arab population from its territory. That's the reality we have to grapple with. For all Buber's and Magnus's hopes, they were sidelined. Mainstream Zionism by the 1940s, especially after the 1942 Biltmore Conference, was openly committed to a sovereign Jewish state. And when they got that state, 750,000 Palestinians were expelled or fled from their homes to make it viable. Villages were destroyed or emptied. This is al-Nakba, the catastrophe for Palestinians. As an anarcho-communist who opposes oppression, I can't overlook that. The impact on indigenous people is a fundamental test of any ideology's legitimacy. You mention early Zionists wanting to live in peace, even quoting ideals of a joint society. But meanwhile, other Zionist leaders were quite clear that a transplantation of one people in place of another was happening. The famous anarchist paper Die Freie Arbeiter Stimme, which had initially opposed Zionism, suddenly reversed in 1929 after some riots and basically endorsed armed Zionist militancy. In doing so, they resorted to racist, dehumanizing depictions of Arabs, calling them savages, and implying Palestinians could never become fully human. I mention this because it shows even some anarchists got caught up in colonial thinking when fear took over. But a group of young Polish Jewish anarchists wrote a scathing reply, rejecting that stance and emphasizing that Palestinian peasants had every right to their land. They reminded readers that the building of Jewish settlements was done over the poor bodies of the Palestinian peasants, land which they and their ancestors worked for generations. This was in 1929, well before 1948's mass expulsions. So anarchists of conscience back then saw the injustice brewing and called it out. They insisted that as much as anti-Semitic violence was horrific like the Hebron massacre of 1929, it did not justify siding with colonialism or abandoning solidarity with other oppressed people. That's the tradition of anarchism I identify with, one that rejects nationalism and colonialism, period, no matter who practices it.
I respect that tradition, trust me. As anarchists, we're supposed to oppose all states and all systems of domination. I'm not here to defend everything the Zionist movement or the Israeli state has done. Far from it, I've protested the Israeli government's policies many times. But I want you to see why many Jews, including anarchists historically, felt that having a Jewish homeland was a matter of survival, not conquest. You brought up 1929 and the anarchist debate in the Yiddish press. Those young Polish anarchists in 1929 who argued for principle over fear, sadly. A lot of those folks likely perished in the Holocaust a decade later. European anti-Semitism was not some abstract threat, it was genocidal. By 1945, 6 million Jews were murdered. The survivors were displaced, traumatized, often with nowhere to go. Many countries closed their doors to Jewish refugees both before and after the war. In that context, Zionism's call for a safe haven makes emotional and practical sense, even if we as anarchists ideally want no borders. It's like, how do you remain a pure internationalist when your people are being slaughtered and no nation will offer refuge? Even the Marxists and communists didn't save the Jews of Europe. Class solidarity often crumbled in the face of fascist racism. Plenty of working men proved they did have a country, contrary to Marx's hopes. Marx said, the working men have no country, but reality begged to differ in the 1930s. So by the end of World War II, the idea of Jews having our own place to rebuild and defend ourselves had enormous appeal across the political spectrum. Some anarchists and socialists who had been anti-Zionist changed their minds after the Holocaust and the violent pogroms they'd endured. Even famous anarchist thinkers felt this. For instance, Bookchin, a prominent anarchist philosopher, wrote in 1986 that the torrent of anti-Israel sentiment on the left needed a reply. He said he had hoped for Israel-Palestine to become a Swiss-like confederation of Jews and Arabs living peacefully together, but that the reality of war and hostility dashed those hopes. Bookchin wasn't cheerleading every Israeli policy, he criticized plenty, but he defended the basic idea of a Jewish population living in that land, autonomous and able to defend itself. He reminded people that in 1948, the new Israeli inhabitants faced an invasion by surrounding Arab armies aiming to annihilate them, and that this desperate fight for survival left deep scars. In other words, the Jewish historical experience, centuries of persecution culminating in near extermination, profoundly shapes why even anarcho-communists might see some legitimacy in Jews asserting self-determination in Israel. It's not about endorsing nationalism in theory, it's about responding to a real material history of oppression.
I do understand the historical trauma and desperation. I'm Jewish too, by the way, I feel that history in my bones. My great-grandparents were Bundists, Jewish socialists in Eastern Europe, who believed in fighting anti-Semitism alongside fighting capitalism without carving out a separate nation. They didn't get a chance to see much success, many died in the Holocaust as well. It's not like anti-Zionist Jews were naive about the dangers, they were just committed to a different solution. An internationalist one. You're right that when the world abandoned the Jews, Zionism's appeal skyrocketed. I can't fault individuals for seeking safety, but we have to ask, safety for whom? At whose expense? The creation of Israel might have been salvation for many Jews, but it became a catastrophe for Palestinians. As anarcho-communists, we don't do ethnic calculus where one people's freedom justifies another's subjugation. You cited Bookchin's view of 1948, that Arab armies invaded and Jews heroically resisted. Yes, the new Israel was attacked from all sides, but let's not pretend the Zionist forces were innocent underdogs only. Even before the Arab armies intervened, Zionist militias had begun a campaign, Plan Dalet and others, that led to massacres like Deir Yassin and mass expulsions. It wasn't simply Arabs telling the Jews, welcome, take half our country, and then suddenly deciding to attack out of pure hate. The Palestinian Arabs rejected the UN partition granted, and some did attack Jewish communities, and then it spiraled. Both narratives, Jews were just colonizers evicting Arabs, and Arabs just tried to genocide the Jews, are simplifications. The truth is messy and ugly, there was communal violence, fear and atrocities on both sides, absolutely. But ultimately, one side lost their homes and country wholesale. Israel was established and hundreds of thousands of Palestinians became stateless refugees. Today their descendants are still mostly refugees or second-class citizens under Israeli rule. As anarchists, being stateless in a world of states is not some cool utopian scenario, it's misery. Palestinians in 1948 effectively experienced enforced statelessness, not the voluntary kind anarchists aspire to. They were and are a people under occupation, or in exile. not in some federated utopia. I think we agree in principle that no state is the end goal, neither Israeli nor Palestinian. But if we snap our fingers today and abolish the Israeli state without a just solution, that power vacuum could just lead to more bloodshed or a new oppressive structure. Decolonization is messy, sure, yet we anarchists have to side with the oppressed. That means concretely opposing the Israeli state's occupation and apartheid policies right now. It means supporting Palestinians' rights to return to the lands they were expelled from, and dismantling the colonial structures that Israel built, the settlements, the segregation, etc. At the same time, I'm not saying present-day Jewish Israelis should be harmed or expelled in return. That'd be a reversal of injustice, not true liberation. Decolonization in Israel-Palestine, to me, means transforming it into something radically egalitarian. No masters, no settlers versus natives, no walls dividing communities. Basically a region of autonomous communes or councils where Jews and Palestinians and others live together as equals. That aligns perfectly with anarcho-communism. But the catch is, to get there, we have to dismantle Zionism as an ideology of ethnic exclusivity. You can't keep the idea of an ethnic Jewish state, or even a culturally Jewish settler project, and still achieve liberation for all. Nationalism, even left-wing nationalism, tends to create outsiders and second-class folks. Historically, Bakunin and Kropotkin warned about this. Nationalism might rally people against an oppressor, but it often just sets up a new boss, a national ruling class or state. Bakunin, in particular, argued that every state, no matter if born from revolution or not, will end up a tool of domination by a minority. The Israeli state is no exception. It's a state like any other, with military elites, capitalist class, etc., only with a nationalist rationale. As anarchists, we should oppose it just as we oppose, say, American or Russian or Palestinian state aspirations. We want statelessness, but a humane statelessness achieved through solidarity and direct action, not by displacing people.
I nod along with a lot of that, actually. The end vision you described, a region of autonomous, intermingled communes where nobody is privileged or oppressed based on ethnicity or religion, that's a vision I share 100%. That's pure anarcho-communism, and I want that world too. The question is how we get there and how we address the present realities. You say we must dismantle Zionism as ethnic exclusivity? I say Zionism doesn't have to mean ethnic exclusivity. Remember, there were Zionists who imagined a multi-ethnic community. For me, being a Zionist anarchist means I care about Jewish community and cultural autonomy after centuries of being denied it, while also caring about universal liberation. I don't see those as mutually exclusive. I basically want what you want, but I'm unwilling to throw the term Zionism completely under the bus because it represents, for many Jews, the affirmation of our dignity after ages of exile and pogroms. I also worry that a blanket anti-Zionist stance can sometimes slide into dismissing Jewish concerns or even anti-Semitism. Not saying you are anti-Semitic. I know you're not. But in broader leftist movements, I've seen anti-Zionist rhetoric turn really ugly, where any talk of Jewish self-determination is mocked, or any acknowledgement of Jewish history is brushed off. Anarcho-communism, at its best, should incorporate an understanding of how oppression intersects, including anti-Semitism. For example, we understand Black liberation, indigenous liberation, etc., are part of the anarchist struggle. I think Jewish liberation, meaning freedom from anti-Semitic domination, is also part of that. The wrinkle is that many people see Israel as enforcing oppression now, not suffering it, so Jewish liberation gets equated with Palestinian oppression in their eyes. It's a tragedy. Two peoples with genuine historical traumas thrown into conflict by larger imperial forces. Ottoman collapse, British colonialism, European fascism. Nationalism on both sides then made it harder to resolve. As an anarchist, I don't align with either the Zionist right wing or the Palestinian nationalists, like the PA or Hamas state-building visions. I stand with the grassroots folk, the Israeli refuseniks, the anarchists who protest against the wall, the Palestinian villagers who practice mutual aid and resist eviction. Did you know that since the early 2000s, Israeli anarchists, like Anarchists Against the Wall, have worked hand-in-hand with Palestinian communities in direct action? They've been doing joint demos, tearing down parts of the separation fence, blocking bulldozers, etc. as acts of solidarity. That, to me, is the living spirit of anarchism in the region, joint struggle. And those Israeli anarchists, many are Jewish kids who grew up with Zionist narratives but chose solidarity over chauvinism. They didn't have to renounce being Jewish or caring about their community. They just realized that true freedom won't come from oppressing another people or entrenching a nation state. So in practice, the difference between you and me might be mostly semantic or emphasis. You emphasize anti-colonialism and rejecting Zionism entirely. I emphasize Jewish self-determination and the original socialist Zionist dreams that were non-statist. But when it comes down to day-to-day politics, I bet we'd be at the same protests against the occupation, against home demolitions, against Israeli settler violence, and also against anti-Semitic attacks or policies anywhere. We both want to decolonize the region. I just insist that decolonization must be bidirectional. It must free Palestinians and not drive out or subjugate Jews. Decolonization usually means the settlers, in this case Jewish Israelis, relinquish privilege and yield power back to the indigenous Palestinians. I agree with that, except here the settlers are deeply attached to the land too, and mostly have nowhere else to go. So it has to be decolonization together, undoing the colonial structures while building a joint society. Is that naive? Perhaps. But I'd argue it's more achievable than either expelling Israelis or expecting Palestinians to remain forever second class.
I think we found quite a bit of common ground, surprisingly. We both ultimately oppose the Israeli state, oppose capitalism and militarism, and we support grassroots direct action across ethnic lines. Where we differ is mostly on the use of the word Zionism and how we weigh the narratives. I tend to see Zionism as an inherently nationalist project that inevitably led to a state and the marginalization of another people. You see it as a broader phenomenon that had and has anti-authoritarian communal potential that was never fully realized. I'll grant that history is not black and white. There were indeed anarchists and Marxists who were sympathetic to some form of Zionism at various points, and others who were fiercely anti-Zionist. Hell, even Karl Marx's own stance on nationalism was complex. He wrote, "The working men have no country," to emphasize internationalism. But later Marxists like Lenin acknowledged oppressed nations might need to fight for self-determination. Many Jewish Marxists, Rosa Luxemburg, the Bund, rejected Zionism, whereas others like Berl Katznelson or Berborchav tried to merge socialism with Zionism. As anarchists, though, we generally lean more towards Luxemburg's view. She famously said she didn't have time for the question of the Jews separate from broader social revolution. For me, any form of nationalism, even of an oppressed group, is a double-edged sword. It can mobilize people against their oppressors, but it can also create new exclusions and injustices. The Israeli case is a prime example. Jewish nationalism galvanized a people to escape persecution, but in doing so it marginalized another people, and created a state apparatus that now oppresses them. That's why I am anti-Zionist. Not because I oppose Jews living in that land or having cultural autonomy, of course not. I oppose the state, and the ideology that built it at the expense of others. I think on that, you actually agree. You don't want a state or oppression either. So maybe the practical difference is, I'm comfortable saying Zionism as implemented was a catastrophe that needs undoing, whereas you want to salvage a kinder, non-statist Zionism out of it.
Yeah, well put. I basically want the term Zionism to include people like me, people who love their Jewish heritage and support Jewish presence in our historical homeland, but who also reject chauvinism and embrace anarchist principles. It's a bit of a tightrope, I admit. Most people hear Zionist and don't think of someone chaining themselves to an olive tree to stop Israeli bulldozers. But there are such Zionists. Perhaps we need a new term, haha. Some say post-Zionist or diasporic Zionist or whatever, but labels aside, it comes down to the society we envision.
Exactly. And I think we both envision something quite similar in the end, stateless socialism in Israel-Palestine, where nobody is discriminated against for being Jewish or Arab, where communities manage their own affairs in cooperation, a bit like how some kibbutzim ideally were internally, but expanded to everyone and without the exclusion. It's basically a return to anarchist basics. No states, no masters, communal ownership of land, federations of communities. I often point to the example of Rojava, the Kurdish-led experiment in Syria, as a stateless democracy model, albeit in a very different context. One could imagine something like that in the whole region, federations of Jewish, Palestinian, mixed villages and neighborhoods, all part of a broader cooperative federation. It sounds utopian given the current bloodshed, but hey, our duty as anarcho-communists is to fight for the utopian in the here and now. That means supporting those doing the work, the activists on the ground, mutual aid networks, CEO resistance initiatives, and opposing whatever stands in their way, which right now is the Israeli state with its settlers, army, laws, and any authoritarian tendencies on the Palestinian side too.
Absolutely. Being an anarchist in Israel-Palestine basically means you get flack from all sides. Pro-state Zionists call you a traitor. Hardline anti-Zionists don't trust you either. The Palestinian Authority doesn't know what to make of you. And obviously the Israeli army isn't fond of you when you show up at West Bank protests. But we do it because our principles demand it. There's a proud lineage of that too, from those early anarchists you cited who stood up for Palestinian peasants in 1929 to modern anarchists who stand in front of Palestinian homes to prevent demolitions. They're all living the slogan, "No one is free until everyone is free."
Nicely said. I think we can wrap this up on that note of unity and struggle. We might disagree on some terminology and historical interpretations, but when it comes down to solidarity and direct action, we're on the same side, the side of freedom against oppression. Whether it's called decolonization, binational federation, or anarchist revolution, the goal is a just peace where both Palestinians and Jews are liberated from state violence, capitalist exploitation, and bigotry. No more walls, no more rockets, no more checkpoints or segregated roads. Instead, cooperation, mutual aid, and autonomy for all the people of the region. That's something worth fighting for together.
From your lips to the universe's ears, comrade. Despite our debating, I'm glad we had this talk. It's nuanced, it's emotional, but these conversations are necessary to build understanding on the left. Too often, the debate is one-dimensional. We've shown it's possible to acknowledge both historical Jewish suffering and Palestinian suffering, and to seek a solution beyond the nation-state framework entirely. If more people realize that anarcho-communism offers a vision where nobody has to be oppressed or expelled, where we reject the false choice of one nationalism or the other, maybe we'd get somewhere.
Here's hoping. At the end of the day, whether you call it anarchist Zionism or just universal anarchism, we want the same outcome, a free life for all in Israel-Palestine, without bosses, without masters, and without borders. Let's keep working side by side on that.
Agreed. Solidarity, my friend. Kahin state solution.
Solidarity?